A turning point in relations. That is how the Iranian president has described his visit to Moscow. In a visit at the personal invite of the Russian President Vladimir Putin. Raisi, who has already held a one-on-one with Putin, has said that Iran intends to enhance cooperation in a variety of fields like military and trade. In this edition of The Spotlight, Iran-Russia relations will be the focus, and also a look at why Iran's president is one of the only presidents of another country to address the Russian State Duma.
Iran's president is in Russia on his most significant trip abroad since taking office in August last year. The historic visit offers the two countries a good opportunity to deepen their ties. In a meeting on Wednesday, Ibrahim Raisi and his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin agreed to work to further enhance bilateral cooperation in various fields.
We can promote our relations in the economy, trade, on the political track. We have no restrictions and nothing holds us back from further developing our ties with friendly Russia. We are not talking about momentary relations, we're talking about a sustainable and strategic relationship.
The Iranian president also said that the two nations have an exceptional opportunity to join hands to counter U.S. unilateralism and its sanctions policies.
We are living in extraordinary times when we see efforts to counter unilateral actions by the West, including the United States. We can create synergies in our efforts to work together with one another. For more than 40 years, we have been deterring the United States.
The Russian president also said that Tehran-Moscow relations have been constantly improving.
Despite the pandemic, in 2020, we had a very slight increase in trade, and last year, we saw an increase of 38%.
Tehran and Moscow share common views on geopolitical issues in West Asia, which is already facing numerous challenges, ranging from war and military intervention by some regional and extra-regional powers to economic instability. During the visit, Raisi presented Moscow with a draft version of Iran-Russia 20-year cooperation agreement. He told Putin that the document outlines a roadmap for the two countries' cooperation for the next 2 decades. It seems that Tehran and Moscow are on the path to capitalizing on their political solidarity and expanding relations. They are also looking for consolidating their ties with other countries in the East to build a united front in the face of the West's ever-increasing hostile agenda in the region and beyond.
Our guest joining us for this edition of The Spotlight, we have John Bosnitch. He is a journalist, activist, and political analyst who joins us from Belgrade. Also joining us, Harley Schlanger, spokesman at the LaRouche organization, who joins us from Potsdam, Germany. Gentlemen, welcome to you both. And John Bosnitch, I'm going to start with you. This visit by Iran's president to Russia has been deemed to be an important one, and it has come at the invitation of the Russian President Vladimir Putin. Why is this visit considered to be as important as it's sounding to be?
First of all, it comes at the ideal time for such a meeting of leading heads of state, especially leading heads of state who are both under pressure from the United States and its NATO allies. This is a meeting that has long been awaited to take the relationship between Russia and Iran to the next higher level. And that means greater integration, greater support, and greater interreliance in opposing American dominance through unilateralism, which actually translates to the wanton use of military force.
Greater American, I think you said dominance, to push back against unilateralism, correct?
Unilateralism, and unilateralism translates into war. Okay. That's what we're facing from America.
So I want to take that phrase and get your reaction as to whether you agree, Harley Schlanger, with that or not, and explain a little bit further what that means, really.
Well, I agree exactly with that. The unilateral doctrine of the United States since the end of the Cold War in 1990-91 has been that America is a unipolar power, and that because the United States supposedly won the Cold War, it has a right to impose its policies on every nation. Now, what we're seeing is a rebellion around the world to that, which includes the Russian and Chinese at the in the leadership of that, pushing for a Eurasian integration policy to counter the American NATO military force. Now, this is something that the American leadership, and by American leadership, I don't mean the American people. I mean the bankers, the insurance companies, the war machine that controls policy in the United States. They are intending to impose a global order based on Western financial policy. And Russia will not submit to that. China won't submit to that, and neither will Iran. So the potential exists for a counterpole to that. And the more the US and NATO push toward war, the stronger the counter alliance becomes.
It's very interesting how this military alliance is forming and being enhanced, John Bosnitch, in a sense, between Iran and Russia. This trip has been something that both presidents have talked about, the enhancement of their military or defensive cooperation. And it comes at a time where just days ago, there was an announcement made that there's going to be Russia, Iran, Chinese war games that are going to happen. And it goes back to what you said, which comes at a pivotal time when the U.S., NATO, I mean, the U.S. should really just, the initials should be part of NATO, I guess. But anyways, the two are pushing against Russia, and the U.S. promoting this idea of war based on a false pretense that Russia has said. What does this three-way military exercise, or what kind of message does that send to the U.S.?
Well, I think that this is the smartest move that Iran, Russia, and China can continue to be making, and that is to band together to protect each other. The United States operates in a very cowardly way by attacking a lone, relatively defenseless member of the opposing side, and they decide who the opposing side is just based on only on their own interests. And what the United States routinely tries to do, not just in military affairs, but even in political affairs with its own allies, like Japan, like Germany, America isolates these of its own allies who do not follow orders to the letter. Now, if that's what they do to their allies, can you imagine what they're doing to Russia, Iran, and China? And therefore, for the simple means of survival, Russia, China, and Iran are banding together, and they are creating a center of power which can only grow as more and more independent sovereign countries realize that their sovereign safe in the hands of the United States.
Well, one of the things that is a common and shared thing that Russia and Iran have, and that is the way that the U.S. sanctions has been weaponized by the U.S. against both of them. And of course, one of the things that they both want to capitalize on is increase trade. But one of the main aims is to push for de-dollarization. They've already started that. They do their national currency in their bilateral trade, but that needs to be taken a step further, Harley Schlanger. Russia and China announced a new infrastructure for financial system to bypass SWIFT. Do you think that all of these will actually make this de-dollarization become a reality?
Well, I think the more the U.S. pushes sanctions, which in our opinion are war crimes, you can kill people in some ways more efficiently by cutting off credit, by cutting off delivery of food, delivery of medicine. That's what the sanction system is. The Caesar sanctions, for example, against Syria, or the freezing of funds that belong to the Afghan people. That's the kind of dirty game the U.S. and NATO are playing. Now, it's interesting because the Germans are starting to move out from under that. there's a very important article in Handelsblatt today, the German business daily, which said that it would be a mistake to kick Russia out of the SWIFT system because of the damage that would do with the European trading partners of Russia and China. In the meantime, the Russia-China alliance is not just military. It's based on expanding the influence of the Belt and Road Initiative. It's based on energy, including oil and gas, but also nuclear power. And it's an ideal connection with Iran to bring Iran into the Belt and Road Initiative. I don't know if you know this, but Syria just this week signed an agreement to join the Belt and Road Initiative. The importance of the Belt and Road Initiative is that it's not controlled by the dollar, it's not controlled by London and Wall Street, and it represents an alternative approach to economics, namely investment in production, not in speculation. So I think the idea of Russia, Iran, China, maybe India will be a part of this because Putin was recently in Delhi for meetings with the Indians. You're actually beginning to see a shift away from the control of the narrative by the City of London and Wall Street and Washington toward the development of sovereign nations.
Well, you have had Iran actually try to capitalize on what it is now becoming very apparent, and that is this looking to the east. We know that the implementation stage of the 25-year China agreement, John Bosnitch, was just announced days ago by the Iranian foreign minister. You have this trip that's being made by the Iranian president to Russia, which again cements their ties, especially when it comes to trade. You have Iran part of the SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which the Russian president just in his bilateral meeting with Iranian president said, you know what, you also need to become one in the sphere of this Eurasian economic union. So my point being is you're having this eastward push, and that kind of doesn't, in a sense, show the U.S. failure in its foreign policy when you have all these countries pushing towards Russia and China and their alliances there?
You know, there's a sort of a common saying in English that goes like this: if all you've got is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And if the United States has basically only a military-industrial complex at the core of its economy, then they must push for conflict. And so long as they were the only bully on the street and that they were ready to use their forces, have support from England and France and other countries, then there was no problem for them. But now we've got Russia and China and serious military power, and we're seeing Iran developing its own national defense. I think we're going to see a real steep learning curve for the leaders of the United States here. In the past, the United States could do whatever it wanted because it did not care. Its leadership, it's a small clique that leads the United States. Its leadership had nobody to answer to because they controlled the media completely. With international media like yours, like Russia Today, like Chinese media, like other media that are coming up on the internet and on people's phones as they walk to and from work, the picture of the world is changing. And so long as America cannot control the picture of the world, they can no longer ignore what other people think of them. And this is where China, Russia, and Iran working together can show the world that solidarity can stop aggression by America.
Well, one of the places that the union of Russia and Iran proved to be very successful, Harley Schlanger, that is in the case of Syria. And when it comes to that, the message that sends the U.S. in some sense should be that, you know, they're not going to be able to help the regional countries when you have Russia and the security cooperation that exists between Russia and Iran, for example. Do you think that countries in the region are taking note of this? We know that, for example, the U.S. claims it wants to pull out of the West Asia region, or Middle East as others call it, but others say no, it's still going to be there. But how does it look when countries see Iran and Russia enhancing their, especially military ties?
Well, that's a very important point because the Syrian example showed the limits of U.S. military power. The U.S. has dominated, and not so much because of the military power, because outside of the large invasion force that was sent into Iraq and Afghanistan, they're using tactics such as color revolutions for regime change, sanctions, and so on. But when the Russians came into Syria and showed that they were not going to allow the United States to overthrow the Assad government, the U.S. failed. The U.S. is still there trying to take oil and impose sanctions. But what happened was it exposed the fact that the U.S. was behind the so-called Islamic terrorist movement. The so-called moderate rebels were really ISIS and Al-Qaeda, backed and trained by the U.S. Now, another example of this is what just happened in Kazakhstan, which is a very large country. It's not highly populated, but it has a lot of raw material wealth. They tried a color revolution there, including bringing in jihadists from Syria, from Iraq, and from Afghanistan. But the Russian forces came in very quickly and crushed the rebellion. And what Putin said is, we will not tolerate color revolutions. So the lesson of Syria, the lesson of Kazakhstan, and now we're seeing in Ukraine, and just a quick word on this, there are people in the United States, including inside the establishment, who are coming face to face with the reality that Putin is not bluffing, that he's very serious. He's insisting that there be security guarantees to protect the Russian people and the Russian nation. And the U.S. can threaten to kick Russia out of SWIFT. If they do that, it will harm the West. They can threaten retaliation. Who is going to take the risk of losing a country in Europe to defend a Ukrainian regime which is corrupt and includes in it neo-Nazi elements in the defense and security forces? So in this case, the Russians are holding a good, strong hand. The alliance with China makes it even stronger, because now the American military fears that if they go to war with Russia, it's going to be Russia and China. And then adding Iran, look, Iran played an extremely valuable and important role in defeating the color revolution insurgency inside Syria. Mm-hmm. And I think people in the West recognize that. And it shows that Iran, when necessary, is capable of defending the interests not only of its own country, but of the region.
So it's like pieces of these puzzle, John Bosnitch, that if you put them together, it kind of shows that the U.S. is not only outstretched, but is ineffective. And I'm talking about the West Asia region, because there's also this Persian Gulf collective security plan that has been proposed by the Russian Federation. Iran has its own proposal also, but together, really, it's about taking the security in their own hands in this area. Does the U.S. then, is it calculating all these different things that are happening when it comes to these alliances that are getting stronger, like Iran and Russia, in how it's conducting itself in the region?
You know, I repeatedly say this when I discuss the way international political affairs are governed on America's side. I worked in Washington, and I'm very familiar with how these decisions are made. They don't actually care if they make mistakes, because the mistakes in pressuring other countries to do what they order them to do can only lead to war, which also helps the American economy, because the American economy is still a war-based economy. So they don't care about whether something is a mistake or not, because if they cause damage by pressuring a country or sanctioning a country, or if they cause damage by bombing a country, either way they're achieving their results. And this is why what they do and what they say has to be analyzed from people, especially people like myself, who was born and grew up and educated in the West and worked in government in the West and saw from the inside the criminality of the basic approach of the Anglo-American Empire. We have to speak out, because if we speak out and we join the people of Iran, the people of China, the people of Russia, and other people around the world, the loudness of our voice should be enough to wake up the American people who are in just a deep slumber under the control of their own government.
Final question, Harley Schneider, goes to you, and I have to ask this question, at least because our reporter said that everybody in Russia, all the reporters there in Russia are talking about this. Chairman of the State Duma attended the inauguration ceremony of Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi. And now you have the Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi, at the invitation of Putin, one of its items on its itinerary is to address the State Duma. How important is that when you don't really recall the last time a president of another country addressed the State Duma?
Well, it's very important. I mean, it shows the degree to which Russia is looking to Iran, not just as a regional player, but as we've been discussing, as part of an alternative security architecture. One of the things Putin has been stressing is that we need to change the security architecture. And what that means is break the power of what John just called the Anglo-American Empire. Remember, the Anglo-American Empire is based on a British notion of geopolitics, which means there must never be union between European countries and Eurasia. But we're seeing now in Ukraine, we're seeing it in the so-called Middle East, a fight where countries are beginning to recognize that Eurasian integration makes sense for them. So being brought into the Duma is a very important body. Russia is emerging as a real international power. And the honor given to the Iranian president is just a reflection of the potential for this new order that's not controlled by the unipolar forces in Washington and London, but actually represents the interests of the vast majority of the world's population. So I would say this is extremely important, and I would give my congratulations to the people of Iran for this kind of recognition.
Thank you very much. We're going to end it on that note. Harley Schlanger, spokesman of the LaRouche organization from Potsdam, Germany. John Bosnitch, a pleasure. Thank you for your contribution. Journalist, activist, and political analyst from Belgrade. And with that, we come to an end for this edition of The Spotlight. Thanks so much for tuning in. Newsroom@presstv.ir is our email address. Any thoughts or reactions to this program or anything else that you'd like. From me, it's goodbye until the next program.